Chapter 1. The Letter That Says Murder. On a winter evening in the year 1844, a young naturalist in a quiet country house in Kent sat down at his desk and wrote a letter. He wrote it to one friend, the botanist Joseph Hooker. The letter survives. It is one of the most famous private documents in the history of science. This is the man who wrote it. The letter said this: Darwin to J.D. Hooker, 11, January 1844. I am almost convinced, quite contrary to opinion I started with, that species are not, it is like confessing a murder, immutable. That is the sentence we are going to spend this hour inside. In the winter of 1844, a young naturalist in a quiet country house in Kent had just written the most dangerous sentence in modern biology in a private letter to one friend, addressed to no one else. What followed was the longest wait in the history of science. Why did he wait? The gentleman's book that finally came out of that wait changed biology forever. This is the story of the wait, and of the man who could not bring himself to publish until the world forced his hand. Chapter 2. The Idle Genius. Let us go back to the very beginning, to an inheritance, a household, and a serious child who did not yet know what he would become. Charles Robert Darwin was born on the 12th of February, 1809, in Shrewsbury, the fifth of 6 children of Dr. Robert Darwin and Susanna Wedgwood. The Mount, his family home, was one of the largest houses in the town. From his terrace, you could see the loop of the Severn, and on clear days, the long Welsh hills beyond. The household the boy was born into was the household the Industrial Revolution had paid for. His father was one of the wealthiest doctors in England. His mother was a Wedgwood, and the Wedgwoods had made their fortune from pottery. 2 of the great 18th century fortunes, medical money and China money, had been quietly joined in marriage. The boy would one day marry into them again. The mother died when he was 8, and the household closed gently around him. 3 older sisters, almost grown, took her place. His own taste, he would remember in later life, was for collecting. He collected shells, seals, francs, coins, minerals. He would write that the passion was clearly innate. None of his sisters or his brother ever had the same instinct. It is the first sentence of the man he would become in a single 8-year-old sentence. His father sent him at 16 to Edinburgh to study medicine. The boy hated it. He was sickened by the operating theater, where surgery was performed without anesthetic, the patient held down, the speed of the knife measured by the patient's screaming. 2 years later, his father, who had begun to suspect that Charles would never practice, proposed another profession instead, the Church of England. Charles read Paley on the evidences of Christianity. He read him carefully. He would write in later life that he could have reproduced the whole of the evidences from memory. The career his father chose for him was, in his own words, a country clergyman. He was being groomed for the pulpit. The pulpit, as it turned out, would never hold him, but the things he learned for it would. Cambridge. 3 years of almost no work. He shot, he rode, he drank a little too much with a sporting set, he played cards, he collected beetles with a passion that bordered on the comic. There is an old story that he once held a beetle in his mouth for safekeeping because his hands were full. Whether the story is true hardly matters. The kind of boy who could be invented around it is the boy Cambridge got. And yet he was reading too, in a scattered way that was not idle at all. He read Paley's Natural Theology and the careful design argument it made that every contrivance in nature is the work of a contriver, lodged in him and would not leave. He graduated 10th on the list of January 1831. He did not, at this point, in the least doubt the strict and literal truth of every word in the Bible. The teacher who saw him was John Stevens Henslow, the professor of botany. Henslow was a quiet, devout man, beloved by his students, the kind of teacher who took undergraduates on long walks into the Cambridgeshire countryside to look at wildflowers. Darwin attached himself to Henslow, as he would attach himself to no one again until he met his wife. And it was Henslow, in the summer of 1831, who received a letter from a Captain Fitzroy preparing to take HMS Beagle on a surveying voyage around the world, asking if he could recommend a young man to serve as the ship's naturalist, unpaid. Henslow recommended Darwin. Almost did not. The Beagle berth was offered and accepted. Without it, Darwin would have been ordained into the Church of England. With it, the second son of a Shrewsbury doctor sailed into the largest single body of empirical work any private naturalist had ever undertaken, and the rest of the century and the rest of biology turned on the hinge of his going. Chapter 3. 5 Years Under Sail. Chapter 2. 5 Years Under Sail and a Slow Eye-Opening. The captain who would lead the voyage was Robert Fitzroy, 26 years old, an evangelical aristocrat, a fierce and depressive man, a follower of the phrenologist Lavater, who believed that the shape of a man's nose was a measure of his character. Fitzroy very nearly rejected Darwin. He thought the naturalist's nose was wrong. He was persuaded in the end, and the Beagle set sail from Plymouth on the 27th of December, 1831. HMS Beagle was a Cherokee-class brig of just 90 feet at the gun deck, a tiny three-masted sailing vessel that would carry about 74 people across every ocean of the world. Her naturalist's berth was a narrow shelf in the chart room. Darwin would be sick for nearly the entire first leg. He would write to his cousin that he positively suffered more from seasickness 3 years out than at the beginning. He kept working anyway. The first stop that mattered was Brazil. The Beagle put in at Salvador, then at Rio. Darwin was a young man who had grown up in a comfortable Whig household that took the moral wrong of slavery for granted. He had not been prepared for what he saw. On a ferry crossing back from a long ride in the country, he waved his arms at a black ferryman, trying to make him understand where he wanted to land. The man thought he was about to be struck. Instantly, with a frightened look and half-shut eyes, he dropped his hands. Darwin would write later, "I shall never forget my feelings of surprise, disgust, and shame at seeing a great, powerful man afraid even to ward off a blow, directed, as he thought, at his face." This man had been trained to a degradation lower than the slavery of the most helpless animal. The slavery of Brazil is what converted the comfortable Whig into the lifelong abolitionist. The second stop that mattered was Patagonia. The Beagle made long excursions inland, and Darwin walked out into the Badlands where the bones of extinct mammals lay on the surface. He found the jaw of a toxodon, an animal as big as a hippopotamus, with the teeth of a rodent. He found fragments of Megatherium, the giant ground sloth. He found the bones of Macrochania, a kind of giant llama with a small trunk. What struck him, slowly, was that these extinct giants were not strangers to the modern fauna. They looked like the giant versions of the small armadillos, the small sloths, the small llamas still alive in the same continent. It was as if the dead were the ancestors of the living. He did not yet have the word for what he was seeing. He would have the word soon. The third stop that mattered was Chile in the winter of 1835. Darwin was ashore when the great earthquake struck. He was thrown to the ground. When the shaking stopped, he walked the coast and saw, with a trained eye of a Lyellian geologist, that the land had been raised. Mussel beds that had lived below the tide line were now stranded in the open air, 2 or 3 meters above the water. Whole fields of dead shellfish lay bleaching in the sun. The world was not the stable, finished thing the natural theology of his childhood had taught him to expect. The world was a place where land moved and seas retreated, and continents slowly rearranged themselves. This was a world where, given enough time, anything could change. And then, in September of 1835, the Galapagos. The Beagle made a 5-week call to a volcanic archipelago 500 miles off the coast of Ecuador. The islands are bare. They are volcanic, mostly lifeless, ringed by black lava and low cactus, and the strangest collection of creatures Darwin had ever seen. The giant tortoises, each one of them 100 years old or more, weighed 200 pounds apiece. He met 2 of them walking across the broken basaltic lava, and one of them stared at him and slowly walked away, and the other hissed and drew in its head into its shell. These huge reptiles, surrounded by the black lava, the leafless shrubs, and large cacti, seemed to my fancy like some antediluvian animals. The birds were dull-colored, and they did not seem afraid of him. They cared no more for him than they did for the great tortoises. Something was happening on these islands. He could not yet say what. He met the acting governor of Charles Island, an Englishman named Nicholas Lawson. Lawson told him that he could, with a single look at the shell, pronounce with certainty from which island a tortoise had been brought. The tortoises of one island had saddlebacked shells. The tortoises of another had domed shells. The difference, Lawson said, was unmistakable. Darwin paid little attention at the time. He did not yet have the frame, but he did begin to label his specimens carefully by island. He would come back to that labeling 2 years later in his study in London, and the careful labeling would be the hinge of the next century of biology. The Beagle sailed on. Darwin wrote his notes. By the time he wrote the second edition of his journal in 1845, he knew what he had seen. He wrote it down plainly. Let him speak for himself. Hence, both in space and time, we seem to be brought somewhat near to that great fact, that mystery of mysteries, the first appearance of new beings on this earth. He had named a question. He had not yet found the answer. But the question, named in a private book by a young man of 26, would turn out to be the question of the next 100 years. The Beagle came home in October of 1836. Darwin stepped ashore in Falmouth. He unpacked his specimens. He went up to London to begin the work of writing them up. He would never leave Britain again for any extended work. The long second half of his life, the life of notebooks and country houses, the life in which the most consequential private act in modern biology was performed, was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Notebook Years. Chapter 3. The notebooks, the marriage, the move to the country, and the secret named aloud in a letter. Within months of returning, Darwin opened a small leather-bound notebook and began to write down in private his growing suspicion that species were not immutable. He called it his Notebook on Transmutation of Species. He opened it in July of 1837. He was 28. The first entry is a sketch of a tree of life, branches splitting as they rise. The notebooks filled quickly. They are still in the library at Cambridge, in his own cramped hand. In September of 1838, almost exactly a year later, Darwin read Thomas Malthus on population. The insight, in his own words from the notebooks, was that favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones would be destroyed. A small change in the language of inheritance, applied to a vast amount of time, and applied across the entire pressure of population and scarcity, was enough to explain the origin of new species. The mechanism was simple. It had been in the notebooks in plain sight. He had not, until Malthus, seen it. That autumn he wrote a single sheet of paper, folded in two. On one side he wrote the reasons to marry, on the other the reasons not to. Under marry, he wrote children and constant companion. Under not marry, he wrote no children, freedom to go where one liked, and, in the deciding column, not being able to work. He had been working harder than he had ever worked in his life. The deciding entry was the fear of losing the work. He proposed to his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, on 29 January 1839, after a long walk and a long talk. They were married at Maer, in Staffordshire. They were first cousins. They would be happy. 3 years later, in September 1842, the Darwins left London. They moved into a square brick country house called Down House in the village of Down, in Kent, 16 miles south of London, and a quiet world away from it. Darwin would live in this house with his wife and his children and his servants for the next 40 years. He would do almost all his work there. He would write 10 books there. He would lose 2 children there. He would lose his Christian faith there. And he would almost lose his life's work to a man he had never met in a letter from an island in the Dutch East Indies. We will come to all of that. For now, a country house in Kent, in late summer light, and the long private work about to begin. For the next 8 years, he buried himself in a piece of work that, at first glance, had nothing to do with the species question. He took up the barnacles. There are many kinds of barnacle, and Darwin worked through them, one by one, in 4 large volumes, between 1851 and 1854. The work nearly killed him. He would say later that he hated barnacles more than any man ever had. And yet the 8 years of fine, taxonomic work gave him exactly what he needed. When the time came to defend the theory, he would be the man who had already worked through every difficulty of variation and inheritance and embryology in a single, exhaustive group of creatures. In 1842, he had written a 230-page sketch of his theory. In 1844, he expanded it into a longer essay. Neither was published. The sketch and the essay sat in his study. They grew, slowly, by accretion. He would start a much larger work in 1856 that would eventually run to 4 manuscript volumes. None of it was published. And yet, on the 11th of January 1844, in a private letter to his friend the botanist Joseph Hooker, the secret was named aloud. Let him speak for himself again. The same sentence we began with. I am almost convinced, quite contrary to opinion I started with, that species are not. It is like confessing a murder, immutable. The confession had been made. It had been made to one friend. It would be made to no one else by Darwin for another 15 years. Chapter 5. Annie. Chapter 4. The hardest chapter. The name of his favorite child, who died at 10, and the quiet change in him that followed. In the summer of 1844, a year after he had written the sketch, Darwin wrote a letter to Emma. The letter survives. In it, he left instructions for what she was to do in case of his sudden death. She was to publish the essay at a cost of 400 or 500 pounds for editing. He left her a small sum of money to cover the cost. He did not tell her the substance of the theory. He asked her, when the time came, to find the right editor and to apply his small legacy to the publication. The instruction reveals how deeply private the work still was, and how completely Emma had been admitted into the secret, even without knowing what the secret was. Darwin was, by the mid-1840s, a chronic invalid. He vomited. He had eczema. He suffered palpitations and exhaustion so severe that he could not work more than a few hours on a good day. He consulted doctor after doctor. None of them helped much. The leading modern diagnosis is that he had caught Chagas's disease from the bite of a kissing bug in Argentina in March of 1835, and that the disease was making slow, intermittent trouble for the rest of his life. Other candidates have been proposed: Crohn's disease, lactose intolerance, anxiety, all 4 at once. He never got a clean answer. He managed the symptoms with a daily routine of walks on his sandwalk, a gravel strip at the bottom of the garden, and on each lap he would set down a small flint on a path-side stone. When the flints ran out, he would turn around and walk back, counting the other direction. The count of the flints was his measure of the day. Anne Elizabeth Darwin, called Annie, was born on the 2nd of March, 1841. She was his second child and his eldest daughter. She had in her father's description a spontaneous affection that touched him deeply. She liked to smooth his hair and pat his clothes into shape when he came in from a walk. She was, in the words of his cousin William Darwin Fox, the apple of her proud father's eye. She was the only child of his he ever said he preferred. He would say so, openly, to Fox, 2 years after her death. He would never say it of another. In 1849, Annie caught scarlet fever, along with 2 of her sisters. Her health never fully recovered. Some have suspected she was consumptive. By the spring of 1851, she was often unwell. Darwin took her in March of that year to the water cure establishment at Great Malvern run by a Dr. James Manby Gully. Gully was the leading water cure doctor of his generation, the man who had treated Tennyson and Dickens and Carlyle and a long list of the Victorian eminent. Darwin himself had been to Gully the year before his marriage. The hope was that the water cure would help Annie as it had helped her father. It would not. In the third week of April, Annie developed a bilious fever. Gully sent for Darwin. He was back at Malvern by the middle of the month. He wrote to Emma at Down House, daily bulletins, sometimes twice daily. "She looks very ill," he wrote on arrival, although her face lighted up, and she certainly knew me. "She has not had wine, but several spoonfuls of broth and ordinary physic of camphor and ammonia." 2 days later, "Dr. Gully is most confident. There is strong hope." A day after that, watching the bright green fluid she had brought up, and exaggerated one of my mare illness. He sat with her. He could do nothing else. Anne Elizabeth Darwin died on the morning of the 23rd of April, 1851. She was 10 years old. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Gully, gave the cause as bilious fever with typhoid character. Darwin buried her in the churchyard of the Great Malvern Priory. He wrote her memorial that night. Let him speak for himself in the words he would never show to anyone but his wife. "We have lost the joy of the household and the solace of our old age. Oh, that she could now know how deeply, how tenderly we do, still, and shall ever, love her dear, joyous face." A few days later, in a letter to his cousin William Darwin Fox, who had also lost a child, he broke open. "She was my favorite," he wrote. "Her cordiality, openness, buoyant joyousness, and strong affection made her most lovable. Poor dear little soul. He never went back to Malvern for years." To Fox, years later, old thoughts would revive so vividly that it would not have answered, but I have often wished to see the grave. The thought of that time, he said, was yet most painful to him. Poor dear happy little thing. A small headstone was cut for Annie at Malvern. It read, by his instruction, only this: "A dear and good child. There were to be no angels." There was to be no memorial of any kind at the Down Parish Church. The death was, by his arrangement, almost invisible from the outside. The death was, on the inside, the most consequential event of his private life. The historians who know him best have argued for a long time about what Annie's death changed in him. The two best modern biographers of Darwin, working from the same letters and the same notebooks, read the change differently. Janet Brown reads it as one more grief in a long chain of griefs. The death sharpened a man who had already begun to slip from Christian faith. Adrian Desmond and James Moore read it as the hinge. The slow doubt became, after Annie, a settled conviction. The two readings can both stand. What can be said is this. Within a year of Annie's death, the notebooks in which Darwin was quietly assembling his theory of natural selection had begun also to record, with increasing firmness, the quiet death of his belief in a God who watched over individual lives. The theory he was building, the theory that explains the design of nature without any need of a designer, was the theology he could live with. A world without providence, where the less fit died because they were less fit, was, after Annie, the only world he could bear to inhabit. The Barnacles were finished in 1854. The Big Book on Species was begun in 1856. The manuscript grew, slowly, to 4 volumes. It was never finished. He was delaying, but he was also building. The Big Book was, in the end, too long and too cautious to publish. The version that finally reached the press would be, by his own description, an abstract of the work he had not been able to finish. Chapter 6. The Letter from Ternate. Chapter 5. A Letter from the Other Side of the World, and the longest week of Darwin's life. In the early summer of 1858, Darwin was at Down House, working on the Big Book. He was about a year and a half from finishing. One morning in June, the post brought a thin, well-wrapped package. The postmark was Ternate, an island in the Dutch East Indies, halfway between Celebes and New Guinea. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar, then suddenly familiar. It was the handwriting of Alfred Russel Wallace, a young naturalist then traveling in the Malay archipelago, collecting rare specimens and selling them to British museums to keep himself afloat. Darwin and Wallace had exchanged a handful of letters on matters of natural history. Wallace had asked Darwin, the year before, if he could possibly procure the skins of some Malayan fowl for him. Darwin had been glad to help. The package did not contain fowl skins. It contained a short handwritten essay, 20 pages long, addressed to Darwin for forwarding to Sir Charles Lyell. Wallace's words were unassuming and polite. The substance was cataclysmic. Wallace had, working in complete isolation in the jungles of the Malay archipelago, hit upon the same theory of evolution by natural selection that Darwin had been quietly working on for 20 years. Let Wallace speak for himself. There is a general principle in nature which will cause many varieties to survive the parent species and to give rise to successive variations departing further and further from the original type. It was Darwin's theory. It was, line by line, Darwin's theory. Darwin sat down at his desk and wrote to Lyell. The letter survives. It is one of the most painful letters in the history of English science. I never saw a more striking coincidence. Darwin wrote, "If Wallace had my MS sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract. 20 years of patient fear, 20 years of private notebooks, 8 years of Barnacles, 6 years of the Big Book, and the priority was about to go to a young man who had not even known Darwin was working on the same question. So all my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed." That is the next sentence of the same letter. Darwin had written out his moral conviction in plain words. He would have to do the honorable thing. He would have to forward Wallace's essay to Lyell and acknowledge that Wallace had got there first. The honor of a gentleman, as he understood it, was at stake. And underneath the honor, the grief of a man who had been working for 20 years and was about to be told that the work did not belong to him. Lyell and Hooker did what gentlemen of their standing did in such a crisis. They improvised. The Linnean Society of London, of which all three men were fellows, had a meeting coming up on the 1st of July, 1858. The agenda had already been set, but there was a small opening. Hooker and Lyell arranged for Wallace's essay, together with a letter Darwin had written to the American botanist Asa Gray in September 1857, outlining his theory, and an extract from Darwin's 1844 sketch to be read at that meeting. The arrangement was, as one of the participants would admit later, a fair piece of priority arbitration. Wallace, in the Moluccas, was not told. Darwin, at Down, did not attend. The audience at Burlington House on the evening of the 1st of July, 1858, numbered perhaps 30 people. The reading order, by the conventions of the society, was alphabetical. The convention happened to coincide with chronology. Darwin's 1844 sketch was read first. Darwin's 1857 letter to Gray was read next. Wallace's 1858 essay was read last. The priority of Darwin's claim was, by the arrangement, established. Darwin, who had not been in the room, was privately embarrassed when he saw the printed proofs a few weeks later. He had assumed his remarks would appear as an appendix or as footnotes to Wallace. He had not assumed that the arrangement would put him first. He accepted the arrangement anyway, with a private wince. Chapter 7. The Origin. Chapter 6. The book that came out of the longest wait in the history of science, and the day it was published. Darwin did the only thing the crisis left him to do. He gave up the 4-volume manuscript. He sat down at Down House on the morning of the day after the Linnean meeting and began to write what he called an abstract of the work he had not been able to finish. The abstract took 13 months and 10 days. It is the book we now call, by the publisher's shortened title, On the Origin of Species. The book's full title, as Darwin and his publisher finally agreed it, is worth saying in full. Let the title card hold it. On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. The title was longer than Darwin had wanted. His first suggestion was even longer. He had proposed an abstract of an essay on the origin of species and varieties through natural selection. The publisher, John Murray, persuaded him that the words abstract, essay, and varieties could come out, and that natural selection should be left to speak for itself. The agreed-upon title was hardly less cumbersome. On the 2nd of October, 1859, Darwin finished the proofs. On the 24th of November, 1859, John Murray published the book in London. The first printing was 1,250 copies. They sold out on the day of publication. The first printing of On the Origin of Species sold out on the day of publication. The book's last paragraph is the one most often read aloud. Let it be read aloud now, in full. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. And, near the end of the book, a single sentence that has been quietly removed from every later edition. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. Darwin put the sentence in the first edition. He knew what the sentence would do. He put it in anyway. The next decade of his life would be the storm the sentence named. The storm broke at the British Association for the Advancement of Science meeting in Oxford on the 30th of June, 1860. The Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, asked Thomas Henry Huxley, who had emerged as Darwin's most aggressive defender, whether he claimed descent from a monkey on his grandfather's or his grandmother's side. The exchange is famous. Whether Huxley's reply was exactly as reported is, by now, impossible to say. The historians hedge. The point of the exchange is not what Huxley said. The point is that the question was being asked in a public lecture room by a bishop of the Church of England about a theory that had been on sale for 7 months. Chapter 8. The Quiet Closing. Chapter 7. The quiet closing of a man whose quiet had done all the work. Darwin did not attend another scientific meeting. He lived at Down House with Emma and his surviving children and his butler, Parslow, who was by now also his bathman. His eldest surviving daughter, Henrietta, ran the household. He worked. He published. He walked the sandwalk each day and counted his flints. He wrote 8 more books over the next 23 years, each of them a small library of accumulated observation. On the fertilization of orchids, on the variation of animals and plants under domestication, on the descent of man, on the expression of the emotions in man and animals, on insectivorous plants, on the formation of vegetable mold through the action of worms. The last book, on worms, sold faster in its first days than the first printing of The Origin. In September of 1863, on Emma's insistence, Darwin returned to Malvern for the first time since Annie's death. He had hoped the return would help. It did not. Within a few days, he had collapsed. He could barely walk in the garden of their rented villa. He kept himself alive with doses of brandy for several days. The water cure, in his words, actually harmed him. Emma would later write that this Malvern misery was the worst Darwin's health had ever been. He left Malvern weaker than when he had arrived, and the weakness would mark his last 20 years. The works that follow The Origin. The Fertilization of Orchids, 1862. The Variation of Animals and Plants under Domestication, 1868. The Descent of Man, 1871. The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, 1872. Insectivorous Plants, 1875. The Formation of Vegetable Mold through the Action of Worms, 1881. Each book was a small, quiet extension of the central argument. The Earthworm book was, to the publisher's surprise, the bestseller of them all. And in the late notebooks, the loss of Christian faith, which had begun slowly decades before and had been sharpened in Desmond and Moore's reading by Annie's death, was at last made explicit. Let Darwin speak for himself. In the words of his autobiography, "The mystery of the beginning of all things is insoluble by us, and I for one must be content to remain an agnostic." The man who had once read Paley's evidences of Christianity so carefully he could have reproduced them the man who had once been almost ordained into the Church of England, ended his life in the position the word agnostic was coined to name. Charles Darwin died at Down House on the 19th of April, 1882. He was 73 years old. He was buried on the 26th of April in Westminster Abbey near the grave of Isaac Newton. The pallbearers were a remarkable assembly. The botanist Joseph Hooker, the geologist Charles Lyell, the zoologist Thomas Henry Huxley, and the co-discoverer of natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace. The American ambassador was there. The Royal Society was represented. The working naturalists of Britain walked the old reformer to his grave. The country house in Kent still stands. It is open to the public under English heritage on most days of the year. The sandwalk is still there, with the flints laid out along the path-side stone. The thinking path goes round in the same loop it always did. The most consequential private act in modern biology is over. The garden remains.